I have to admit, when I was studying history in Trinity, I really hated Charles Stewart Parnell. Really didn't like him. I really hated the whole thing about, Catherine O'Shea, or Kitty O'Shea as she was commonly called. So I never really got into looking at the history of the Parnell family until I discovered Anna Parnell. And then that restored my faith in the Parnell and Parnellites. But I still don't particularly like Charles, but I am very fond of Anna. And Anna was his younger sister, born, well, I'm not sure whether she was younger or older. That's how much I don't know about Charles Stewart Parnell. Born on the 13th of May, 1852 in Avondale in Wicklow, in the family estate. She was the second youngest of 6 daughters of John Henry Parnell, and importantly, his wife, Delia Tudor Stewart Parnell. That's where the Stewart comes from. She was the daughter of the American Commodore, famous for his naval victory against the British in 1812. They had 11 children, 6 girls and 5 boys, one of them being the aforementioned Charles. And the young Parnell family spent most of their time in Avondale until John died at a relatively young age in 1859. Anna was only 7 years old then. 8 years later, when he turned 21, Charles inherited Avondale House and estate, and it would remain in the ownership of the Parnell family until 1891. But who I want to look at is both Anna and her sister Fanny, because you can't understand one without the other. Fanny dies at a very young age, but their early political life is very important, as is the influence of their mother. Now, they were brought up, as many of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy or gentry were, in the family estate. The girls, of course, were not educated in the same way that the boys were. And indeed, Wicklow hadn't been hit badly by the famine, and the Parnells were reasonably good landlords, but the girls would have heard horrific tales of the suffering elsewhere in the country. Anna wrote later that even to persons who were not in existence when they occurred, the horrors of those years have a vividness almost as great as actual experiences of them could produce. And Fanny Parnell, who became a poet, described in poetry and prose the results of evictions, which echoed what happened during the famine years. Although their education was minimal at best, of course those girls being the daughters of a wealthy family, although it wasn't that wealthy, and Fanny and Anna did not have a dowry, so they weren't hugely marriageable, but they would have been marriageable enough. And what they were to grow up to be was to be wives and mothers of similar within their class. However, Fanny particularly was I suppose what you would call now or then, a blue stocking. And her brother John said she had a literary bent from an early age and knew every book in the library. He also claimed she showed patriotism when she was young, insisting on playing with toy soldiers with her brothers, but she would always be the Irish Army. Fighting against the British. And during the Victorian period, the intersection of domestic and public realms gave mothers a key function in the primary education, particularly of the girls. And influenced by their mother, Fanny and Anna were intelligent, independent political thinkers. And who was Delia Parnell? She's actually buried in Glasnevin Cemetery with her son. Delia, according to Dana O'Regan, who's written about her, was the source of anti-British Republican ideals for the young Parnells. She had a strong anti-English attitudes, and American politics, particularly and especially American suffrage politics, were discussed in the household. She was, however, not an activist herself. She was first and foremost a socialite and very much part of Dublin Castle society. But it does seem that she had Fenian sympathies and may have helped Fenians prisoners escape to America after the 1865 arrests. She is known to have regularly received huge numbers of newspapers, American, English, Irish, and Fanny and Anna read avidly. So you can see there is an influence coming from an early age about involvement in politics, being part of a larger society in which you had people, politicians, you had cultural people, you had artists coming to their salon in Dublin. There was also a maternal great-aunt who was an executive member of the American Suffrage Association, who may have influenced Delia, who in turn that's the Irish pronunciation of Delia, if you're in Kerry, Delia, who in turn may have influenced her daughters. So the young daughters enjoyed considerable freedom. Fanny was described as a tall, intense, handsome girl. She was a nationalist, writer and poet. She became an avid reader of the Fenian paper, The Irish People, and supported its militant nationalism. Her first poem, written under Masada, written under a pseudonym, was published in 1864, and 12 more followed in the next 6 months, all fervently patriotic. In 1865, she attended the trial of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. Of course, O'Donovan Rossa was the Fenian whose death Patrick Pearse gave that famous speech at over his grave. So the interconnections between all the revolutionaries from the 19th and 20th century are really interesting. Soon after that, she and her mother and 3 younger siblings moved to Paris to stay there for some time. Then they worked with the American Ambulance in the first months of the Franco-Prussian War, returning to Paris after the collapse of the Commune. The family began to be reduced in financial circumstances following a stock market crash, and a series of satirical articles written in the American Register in 1874, in which Fanny made plain her dislike of the snobbery of the American colony and the materialism of the Parisian marriage market, earned some money from the family. She then decided to go off to New Jersey and lived in the Stewart family estate at Bordenstown there until her death. So why is Fanny important to understand? Because she does die before the Ladies' Land League really takes off, although she's one of the founder members. Like her sister Anna initially, she was very much close to her brother Charles and supported him in all his political endeavours, particularly once he got elected as an MP. She fully supported land agitation, and that was promoted in Ireland by the Irish National Land League, which was founded in 1879. When the New York Tribune attacked Parnell, she wrote a strongly worded defence, and this inspired an interesting publication. Where is it? The Hovels of Ireland, which she sought to bring Irish events to American audience. Interestingly, how many women were involved in propagandizing Irish nationalist and then later Republican politics, because it was the women after 1916 and through 1917, 18, 19 and 20 that went to America and went on speaking tours to publicize Republican politics. Here in the late 19th century, it is Fanny Parnell writing about the distress in Ireland and why the work of the Irish National Land League was very important. She wrote about the injustices that were experienced by the Irish tenant farmer class and landless labourer class. She expressed her disgust at the landowning class, of course, of which she was born into herself. And she explained that although her family owned land, she and her family were Irish nationalists. She said, "The moral energy which inspires men with the ability and the desire to oppose themselves to injustice, to protest against the abuse of power, even when this injustice is part of what they are committing." She explained that they were actually campaigning for justice, even though they were part of the class that delivered injustice. Hovels of Ireland, interesting name, was widely praised and had several reprintings of extracts in different papers and ensured widespread circulation. She also worked on, of course, the Great Famine wasn't the only famine, so there was lots of famines, more localized famines in the later 19th century, and she worked on famine relief funds, which was set up in response to tours by Parnell and John Dillon. And then from Bordenstown, she wrote poetry in support of the Land League. Bouts of ill health forced her to give up lots of her time. However, before she died in 1882, at the age of 33, she did set up the Ladies' Land League in New York. And she wrote to the Irish American paper, The Irish World, appealing to women to form a women's league. This New York branch of the Ladies' Land League had Delia as its president and Fanny and Ellen Ford as its vice president, and was formed on the 15th of October 1880. Other branches would follow. Fanny disliked public speaking, but did speak on behalf of the League because she believed so much in it. Now, she didn't live long enough to see it flourish in Ireland. Interestingly, unlike Anna, Fanny was not a suffragist. She denied that the Ladies' Land League represented a women's rights movement. Like many of her class, she was able to connect her Land League activism more with philanthropy for poor people rather than actually being an activist for women. She said Land League business is essentially women's business because it's the work of philanthropy and humanity. However, Anna Parnell is a different kettle of fish altogether. And it's to Anna that I now want to turn. And I think looking at Delia and Fanny, you realise that Anna is influenced by them, but then becomes a political animal in her own right. She's very close to Fanny and was extraordinarily distressed when she died, but she did commit herself to different ideologies, much more radical ideologies. As Margaret Ward, who has written a lot about Anna Parnell and the Ladies' Land League, said, Anna wanted to set a noble example for all the women of Ireland. It was the only legacy that she hoped for. However, in the beginning, as with Fanny, she was very supportive of her brother and attended Westminster to hear him speak and felt that she could do something with him. She attended the House of Commons in order to witness the obstructionist tactics that he was using, and very effectively as it was. And she watched everything from The Lady's Cage, which she wrote about and which was published in America in the Celtic Monthly in May and July 1880. How they do the House of Commons notes from The Lady's Cage. So really what she's talking about here is women's exclusion from the visitors' gallery, and she uses sardonic humour from which she was quite famous, while her writing made clear her belief in women's equality and the necessity for minority groups to undertake vigorous action to achieve political ends. And this is important because Anna is much more radical, not only than Fanny, but also than Charles. She's much more radical than Charles, and this will be important in their relationship later on. From the high vantage of the Lady's Cage, she gave a bird's eye view of the proceedings, noting wryly, the ladies certainly are much better off than male visitors who are subjected to the very severe discipline by the attendants, not being allowed to speak, and above all, not being allowed to sleep. So, again, ironically, she's talking about how women are excluded from politics. Michael Davitt was one of the people who was very close to her, and he appreciated always her administrative and intellectual capabilities. When she returned to Ireland in 1880 and witnessed the intensification of the Land League campaign, she decided to set up the Ladies' Land League in Dublin. A branch was set up in Dublin on January the 31st, 1881, the LLL. She becomes the first organising secretary at the meeting at 39 Upper Sackville Street, or O'Connell Street. She was the first woman to lead an organisation of Irish women, and the Ladies' Land League stepped into the breach when the male leaders of the Land League were imprisoned. The men, of course, were very sceptical about the ability of the women to organise. This hadn't been done. Now, suffrage women had been campaigning for the vote, but mostly it was letter-writing campaigns. You had Anna and Thomas Halsome, you had various other members of suffrage organisation in both Britain and Ireland who were lobbying and campaigning, but they didn't set up large national organisations on the scale of the Ladies' Land League. By May 1881, there was 321 branches in Ireland. That is comparable to Cumann na mBan in 1914, 15, 16, when it is setting up. Now, Cumann na mBan grows much bigger than that, but really in the beginning phases before the Rising, they would have had about 300, 350 branches throughout Ireland. The Ladies' Land League grows that rapidly. And as we know, they had branches in the United States, but they also had branches in other colonies where Irish people had immigrated to, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The formidable talents of Anna Parnell was the right woman in the right place at the right time, as Margaret Ward said, to demonstrate the hitherto untapped capabilities of women. And here's an image of the Ladies' Land League having a meeting. Like the men before them, the women toured the country, and this is unusual. Particularly middle-class women did not go onto public platforms and make speeches, and they certainly didn't travel around the country on their own without guardians. What they did, of course, at the time was use the marvellous train system where you could get everywhere in this country on the train. So Anna would go, say, for example, from Dublin to Sligo and get off in Longford to make a speech, get off in Mullingar and make a speech, and get off at all the stops along the way and make speeches, which indicates the loss we have endured since that train system was made so much smaller. They often travelled under poor conditions. They attended evictions where there was violence at these evictions, because the RIC and the British Army were being used by the landlords to enforce evictions, and those evictions were resisted. They resisted land grabbing, which was if tenants were evicted, and their tenancies would be offered maybe to local bigger farmers who took them on to increase the size of their holdings. This was seen as land grabbing. They organised boycotts, formed new branches, built houses for the evicted, little huts or turf houses, dealt with legal and agricultural matters, negotiated with the local clergy and armed forces, raised and dispensed large amounts of money. And it's important to remember the money, the fundraising. On the arrest of William Smith O'Brien, they even assumed the publishing of United Ireland and sending that around the country. The organisation they set up had systems of recording data on every estate, landlord and tenant, as well as documenting developments and morale around the country. So they were well placed to take over once Charles Stewart Parnell and Michael Davitt were arrested in 1881 and put in prison. And the Land League was now leaderless. The Ladies' Land League took their place. They raised money for the Land League prisoners and their dependents. They encouraged women to resist eviction. They felt that maybe the RIC and the British military wouldn't attack the women, but they did when evictions were taking place. If families were evicted, they provided wooden huts, Land League wooden huts, for the evicted families. There is evidence that while this cartoon would indicate that the Ladies' Land League called for a boycott of the RIC, there is evidence that there was no boycott of the RIC or police per se, but boycotts of shops and local men, including a marriage boycott of land grabbers. So local women swore they would never marry any local man who had taken over the farm of an evicted tenant. This was to discourage land grabbing, so in fact the RIC wouldn't have been the focus of their boycotts. Anna was also quite sarcastic about the police in her speeches because they raided the Ladies' Land League office a few times, but they also took notes of everything she wrote down and reported back to headquarters, but she did not advocate a full boycott. As Margaret Ward has pointed out about the Ladies' Land League, their work was in complete defiance of every expectation regarding the traditional role of Victorian women. Anna Parnell acknowledged the difficulty of attracting female organisers. But one of those was a woman who would go on to become a great revolutionary activist, a suffrage activist. As a teenager, she joined the Ladies' Land League in Wicklow, and that was Jenny Wise Power. And we know from many of the women who were that little bit older, the revolutionary women, they get their first start as organisers in the Ladies' Land League. For Anna Parnell, the women had to be young on account of the physical strain of the work involved, prepared to travel around the countryside, particularly a countryside that has already experienced large incidences of violence, and be able to speak at mass meetings, confront landlords, agents responsible for relief to the evicted farmers. And this was not what was expected of a Victorian woman. Her sister Fanny did what Victorian women did, that philanthropy, that fundraising, that sending off of the money to the people, the men who were doing the activism. This is the women actually going out there themselves, dispensing funds. A woman I wrote a biography of, Kathleen Brown from South Wexford. Her father was a Land League organiser, and there are letters in that archive from Anna Parnell to Michael Brown talking about the wooden huts that he was to erect if farmers were, or tenant farmers were evicted. And there is in that archive a little membership for 6-year-old Kathleen Brown of the Ladies' Land League. So it really galvanised a whole generation, a young generation of women who would go on to become the leaders. Kathleen Brown is a senator in the Irish Free State Senate in the 1920s and 30s. It wasn't without condemnation and controversy, though. It was often raided, as you can see. Here's Mr. RIC man coming in to see what the women are doing. And the church, the Catholic Church, also condemned it. Archbishop of Dublin, Edward McCabe, said, "Our Catholic daughters, be they matrons or virgins," of course that's all they could be, "are called forth under the flimsiest pretext of charity to take their stand in the noisy street of life. That is not where women are supposed to be." Archbishop Croke, however, did support them and was challenged the letter from McCabe in the Freeman's Journal, calling it a monstrous imputation of the ladies. Eventually, however, the government had enough of the Ladies' Land League. They were sick of their activism, and the banning of the Irish National League made no direct reference to the Ladies' Land League, but many of the women were arrested and a number of them were tried. The police had orders to stop their meetings. Anna Parnell defied that meeting, as did many of her members. And so quite a number of them were arrested, including this young woman in December 1881, 21-year-old Hannah Reynolds, who was imprisoned under an ancient statute from the reign of Edward III. Of course, they had no way of dealing with public women other than prostitution. The original purpose was to keep prostitutes off the streets. And so persons not of good fame, if they did not post a bail for guarantee of their good behaviour, were to be imprisoned. Since Reynolds claimed her behaviour was good anyway, she refused to pay bail and spends a month in Cork jail. In all, 13 women would serve jail sentences under this statute. So, on May the 3rd, 1882, Parnell and the other leaders were released from jail after agreeing to the Kilmainham Treaty. What becomes, this is an improvement on the 1881 Land Act, and he now wishes to turn his attention to the Home Rule movement. I would also argue there is a bit of jealousy in what he does next, or what the Land League does next. I think Anna was too successful, too radical, too beloved of the people for Charles Stewart Parnell. I always knew there was a reason I didn't like him, and I didn't know much about Anna Parnell back in the day. Parnell was determined to see an end to the Ladies' Land League. There had been an increase in violence while he was in prison, and there was a huge overdraft, £5,000, which Parnell, for the Ladies' Land League, which Parnell agrees to clear from central funds only if the Ladies' Land League is dissolved. At a meeting of the Central Committee on August 10, 1882, the Ladies' Land League voted to dissolve itself. Parnell herself was not in attendance because she had heard about the death of Fanny the previous month and was in deep mourning, but this was the end of the Ladies' Land League. And it is the end of any communication between Charles Stewart Parnell and his sister Anna Parnell for the rest of their lives, except through lawyers, where she had to deal with the estate to get the small stipend as heir to her father, well, a very small stipend. Margaret Ward noted that as a political activist, Parnell insisted women should develop their own methods of organisation in order to begin the transformation of their lives. She wrote, Parnell that is, "I observed that we succeeded today in getting rid of the men nearly entirely, and I am sure we all feel much more comfortable in consequence." However, their success had disadvantages. It did bankrupt the Ladies' Land League, and the Land League itself refused to support it on going forward. Their direct and radical tactics did lead to an increase in violence, and the British government insisted, as part of the Kilmainham Treaty, that the Ladies' Land League be shut down. Parnell himself was not about to defend them. Anna never had any communication, as I said, with her brother again. After the dissolving of the Land League, she moved to England, but she retains friendships with Ladies' Land League members and retained an interest in Irish affairs. She retained a strong commitment to the rights of women by supporting, in 1885, a run by Helen Taylor to become a parliamentary candidate. This is before, obviously, 1918 and the granting of the limited suffrage to women and allowing them to run for parliament. It was unsuccessful, obviously. Her personal circumstances were difficult because she only had a small stipend, and she lived then in Cornwall under an assumed name. However, she kept in communication with her friends in Dublin. She wrote poetry and she wrote polemics about the betrayal of the Land League, including a manuscript that remained unpublished for many, many decades called Tale of a Great Sham, which was a full account of the Land League years but included few personal details. She did come back and forth to Ireland. In 1908, she spoke on behalf of Sinn Féin in North Leitrim, but her dismissal of all politicians prompted a hostile reaction from the audience. She concentrated on writing and planned to have a manuscript, Tale of a Great Sham, published in Ban na hÉireann, and she was quite close to Helena Maloney, the editor of Ban na hÉireann. In fact, she paid a fine for Maloney, who had been arrested for protesting the royal visit in 1911. Tale of a Great Sham disappeared for many decades and was found accidentally in I think it was the Skeffington archive much later on, and has been published and republished again by UCD Press last year. She dies in 1911, drowned while swimming under the assumed name Sarissa Palmer, and was buried in Ilfracombe in Devon with only a handful of witnesses present. They did not know who she was. Catherine Maria Anna Mercer Parnell. These quotations are there. The best part of independence, the independence of the mind, which was put up there by the Parnell Society in 2002. Her legacy, written by Andrew Kettle, and I think it is an important legacy. She had a better knowledge of the lights and shades of Irish peasant life, of the real economic conditions of the country, of the social and political forces which had to be acted upon to work out the freedom of Ireland, than any person, man or woman, he had ever met. Anna Parnell would have worked the Land League revolution to a much better conclusion than her great brother. I fully agree with that. She should have the big statue on O'Connell Street. However, Anna Parnell is not totally forgotten. Lucy Keaveney, who happened upon her grave in Devon, led a campaign to get it restored by the Irish government, and as you can see now, it's cleaned up, and as actually the local society have taken on the job of making sure that it is kept in that condition. However, she has also started now a campaign that Anna be brought back to Dublin and buried in Glasnevin Cemetery, although I don't think we should put her in with her brother at all. In 2021, on the 110th anniversary of her death, this radical feminist and founder of the Ladies' Land League was honoured by a plaque unveiled by the Lord Mayor of Dublin on O'Connell Street. It's the Allied Irish Bank, just opposite the Parnell Monument on the top of O'Connell Street, and you can see it there. And then Tale of a Great Sham was republished by UCD Press with updated editing by Dana Hearn, who had published it first 2 decades ago, and an extended and updated introduction by the great historian of the Ladies' Land League, and Anna Parnell indeed, Margaret Ward. She was a radical Democrat who saw equity, as Margaret Ward says, and national self-determination as indispensable for Ireland's future. She was remarkably prescient in predicting armed rebellion in Ireland when she wrote in 1907. She said, in spite of its poor prospects, armed rebellion seems likely to be the next thing either tried or played at here. And I think with all that, we have to agree that Anna Parnell is a true icon of Irish history.